This is the Bruchim podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Previously on the Bruchim podcast. You bring up a really interesting and important point about the medicalization of circumcision in this country and the kind of double-edged sword. I can never avoid the bad metaphors. But what should we call it? The kind of unanticipated conflict that put Jewish Americans in, because this happened in sort of mid-20th century, where it really started to become like a general practice in the United States that was fully medicalized.
There's a great paper called Medicalization and the Mainstreaming of Circumcision in Mid-20th Century America by Elizabeth Reis that we can link in the show notes.
All right, welcome back to the Bruchim podcast. I'm your host, Eli Sargon, and joining me today from New Haven, Connecticut is my co-host, Max Duboff. Max, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Eli. And always great to be working on the Bruchim podcast.
And our special guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Reis. Dr. Reis is an historian and professor of gender and medical ethics at Macaulay Honors College, City University of New York. She is the author of Damned Women, Sinners, and Witches in Puritan New England, and the editor of American Sexual Histories. And in 2021, she published a book called Bodies in Doubt, An American History of Intersex. And finally, in July of 2021, she wrote an incredible article that we're going to be talking about today in American Jewish History, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press, called Medicalization and the Mainstreaming of Circumcision in Mid-20th Century America. Welcome to the Bruchim podcast, Dr. Reis. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to talk about these issues with you both.
I want to start just with the last line of the paper because I really love it and I think it sets the stage. So, quote, ironically, modernization and medicalization both legitimized and threatened a conventional Jewish religious practice, a conundrum that continues to linger within some Jewish communities to this day, end quote. Lizzie, do you want to maybe say a little bit about what led you to this project and how you conceived of it when you wrote this paper?
Yeah, I do want to talk about that last sentence, but we can wait a little bit further into it, but let's not forget about it. So after I wrote my book about the Salem witch trials, which seems like it has nothing whatsoever to do with these issues, but actually I kind of think it has to do with these issues, because in Salem, they were really trying to get at like the definition of who was a woman and who was a man and what it meant to be a so-called witch. And it was very tied up with gender politics. And when I moved to start my research on the history of intersex management in the US, even though the questions weren't religious anymore, really, they were much more, had to do with medical ethics. They were still kind of grappling with some of the same questions, like what is the definition of female? What's the definition of male? How are you going to transform people's bodies to kind of become, quote unquote, normal? So I had been working on the intersex book for many years. The second edition was published in 2021. The first edition was in 2009. So like more than 10 years had passed and things had really changed in what was going on in intersex politics. That intersex book got me interested in issues of autonomy and consent, because most of the surgeries that were done to babies that were born with intersex traits were done when they were just babies, and they couldn't consent because they were an infant, so they were infants, so they couldn't consent to anything. And that got me thinking about other things, in which people don't consent, and yet something is done to them physically, surgically, permanently, including circumcision. And the first thing that I think that I wrote about circumcision was maybe like the early 2012, maybe, when the American Academy of Pediatrics released a statement that said that the health benefits of circumcision outweighed the risks. And then I kind of looked into that and saw that that contradicted an earlier statement that said the opposite. And then that had contradicted something else 10 years prior that said the other thing. So I saw that this is really I think I titled the article "The Flip Flop Over Circumcision," something like that, because I saw that they are really changing their minds about the health benefits or the disadvantages of circumcision. It wasn't set in stone. And so I wrote a short blog about that. And then from there, it somehow I started thinking about, well, I know that, I was raised Jewish, so I knew that Jews circumcised baby boys, but I knew that it had nothing to do with health for religious Jews. And that got me interested in the bigger question, because I also knew that circumcision rates really soared in the US in the mid-20th century. So it wasn't just Jews that were circumcising, it was everybody. And, why did that start to happen? And that's where the kind of the confluence between Judaism and health and ethics and history kind of all came together. And that's what got me interested in that, to write this paper.
So let's talk some about this process of medicalization. And I think along the way, we'll return to that last sentence, which is so fertile in so many ways. So correct me if I'm wrong, you were working with an archive, right, of the New York Board of Rabbis?
Yeah, I went to I didn't know anything about this research really, but I figured, okay, I'm in New York, the Jewish Historical Society, those archives must have something. And so I went in there to look, and I saw that they had many boxes of that Board of Rabbis going back earlier into the 20th century, starting in the early 20th century, but a lot from the 50s and 60s.
Before we go on, can you just explain what the New York Board of Rabbis was? Like, it was some kind of institution that existed or continues to exist. Is that right?
Yes, I think there is a website for it, so I think it does still exist. Its purpose was to bring together the sects of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, to kind of bring together so that there could be a Jewish voice, like a unified Jewish voice. I think that was its original purpose. And what it was filled with was letters between rabbis about various issues, letters that were sometimes heated at times. I have to say, it was kind of fun to read through these letters because you'd have both sides were often collected. So sometimes it was done on like carbon paper. So you could see, the letter that the head of the board wrote out, and then the response that he got, and then his response back to the rabbi. And I could see from these letters that there were a lot of controversies that they wanted to just settle. For instance, there were some rabbis who were willing, even though they knew the rules, and they knew that you're supposed to circumcise a baby boy on the 8th day. There were some rabbis who were saying, well, it's more convenient for this family to do it on the 6th day. And, that's what I'm going to do. And then a lot of rabbis would write back because they knew that this was happening with this one rabbi. They would write to the head and say, I really don't think this is right. This guy should not be a mohel. And if he's going to be doing this, and just very angry at certain people. And the reason why it mattered is because they were also trying to figure out how to certify mohels and who was going to be a legit mohel. And that mattered because this was the time when these mohels were going into the hospitals to do this. And most of them were not physicians. And so they cared about certifying them to justify their entrance into the hospital to do something that was clearly a medical procedure. When it was just done in someone's home, you could just think of it as a bris. There's really nothing medical about it, but when you are bringing it into the hospital to do it, it's much more obvious and explicit that actually this is a surgery. And this became a whole question. Is this a surgery, or is this a religious ritual?
So let's take a quick step back for a second. I just want to give our audience a little bit of context in terms of the storyline of the development of events here so that we can really start digging into this a little deeper. So what happened in the United States in the 20th century is that there was a process of medicalization of circumcision. This practice that had until a certain point basically been a religious practice now became a medical practice that was being recommended for purported health reasons. And as that happened, the relationship of the Jewish community to circumcision was challenged in a really interesting way. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. That's Yeah,
So
excellent.
one other process that's really important here, right, is the transition from women primarily giving birth at home to primarily giving birth in the hospital, right? And so something I find really fascinating about the paper is the way that broader shift affected circumcision, as well as how various kinds of concerns about health in general and hygienic practices really led to concern about and then attempts to assuage concerns about circumcision, and that contributed to further medicalization as well.
Right. That's exactly right. So women going to the hospital to have babies was something that came about in the mid 19th century when physicians kind of convinced mostly white middle class women that it was safer to have a baby in the hospital than at home. As it turns out, this is a little off topic, but as it turns out, in the very beginning when this shift happened, it really wasn't safer to go to have your baby in the hospital because the doctor would go from baby to baby without even, maybe without even washing his hands or the instruments. And I say his because the doctors were men, so go from baby to baby. So if there was an infection with one birth, it would spread to other births and other women and people died. Whereas a midwife who came to your home, by the time she left the birth, of course, she would wash her hands before she, went on her way. Anyway, by the mid 20th century, I can't remember the exact statistics, but it's in the 90 percentile of births were hospital births. And women used to stay a long time. And I'll just give my own family example to illustrate this point. When my grandmother, she was born in 1905, and she had my uncle in 1932, I believe, early 30s in St. Louis. And she stayed in the hospital 10 days. And there was no medical reason why she needed to stay. I mean, it's not like anything was wrong with her or the baby, but that was just the time that people stayed in the hospital. So on the 8th day, they had a bris in the hospital. And presumably a mohel came in there. I don't know all those details because she's dead now. And then when my mother had my brother in 1960, she left the hospital on the 3rd day and had a circumcision on day 3 with an obstetrician who was usually the person who did it. And she was fine with that because she wasn't really so observant at all. But she remembers that when she came home and she had like a baby nurse helping her, and that nurse was Jewish and observant, and she was horrified that my mother had this bris done on the 3rd day and basically said it didn't count and to my mother. And my mother said, well, for my purposes, it counts. I mean, a Jewish boy, he's circumcised, good enough. So that's just one example. But during that time period when women were staying in the hospital through the 8th day, the rabbis wanted to make sure that mohels were allowed to go into the hospital to perform these circumcisions. And in order to do that, that got them thinking about how to certify them, how to make sure it was safe. And basically, they were very concerned with how to appear modern in like a medical sense. And so that women would continue to do this because they were worried that people, once they started leaving the hospital, they wouldn't go to a mohel anymore. They would just have it done by an obstetrician. And then again, that raised this question for them. Well, is it a surgery or is it a religious ritual? Do you have to have all the prayers? Yes or no? Maybe you don't. So it wasn't, some people care about the prayers. Some people only care about the circumcision.
One of the things in your paper that was really fascinating to me was that in this period that you're talking about, which I believe you stated was somewhat short-lived, where the women would stay in the hospital through the 8th day. And so there was an opportunity actually for a kind of collaboration between the medical system and the religious system. And that's the part that I found so fascinating, was that there seemed to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but based on what you wrote, there seemed to be a kind of willingness on the part of the medical and health authorities to work with the religious community to figure out a way to integrate a mohel into the hospital system for these women. Did I get that right?
Yes. And one thing that I didn't do, probably somebody could expand this paper and make it into a whole book, just this era, but it's not going to be me. But, somebody who was going to do this could look at like hospital administration records in New York, because I think it was 60 something hospitals that were doing this. There was a big list that I found in the archives of maybe 66 hospitals that were allowing this. And there were some letters, back and forth between the hospital administrators, like the head of the hospital, and the rabbi asking, how much in advance do we have to ask you to get the mohel? Can parents request certain mohels to come in and do it? Questions that you might want to know about from if you were a hospital administrator, you'd want to know, like, what's the easiest way to do this integration? But it would be, it would be interesting if somebody wanted to expand this, to go look at the records of all these hospitals, if they still exist, to see what letters or, any kind of primary sources that they might have about this. I mean, that would expand things quite a bit. I mean, I'd like to know that myself, but I'm not expanding this research, but I feel like that would be interesting to know, like, how easily this all happened from the hospital's perspective, because I can certainly imagine the hospital saying, what? We don't want random people who aren't doctors coming in here doing surgeries. Like, there could be bad outcomes. What if something bad happens?
Exactly. It's like, the medical establishment today is so territorial that when I read this, I was like, wait, what? They were letting rabbis and mohels into like sterile environments to do surgeries. It's like so crazy.
Not only that, then they were letting them have a party afterwards in another room, where you could, because a bris, people are celebrating. It's a celebratory thing that you've had a baby, in many families. And they were letting them do that too. So, but, again, like when I looked at the list of these hospitals, there were a lot of Jews in New York, so I feel like that they were catering to the population of who their hospital patients and clients were. I doubt this was happening in, rural Nowheresville, although it was happening in St. Louis. So, but there were Jews there too.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to look at this sort of historical era as well, maybe short-lived, when mohels were coming into the hospital, and compare it with in the 1980s when the Reform and Conservative movements started their mohel training programs, that they were, and still to this day, only train as mohels people who are already medical practitioners, right? So we have this sort of start maybe of the medicalization of circumcision in some important ways, although it actually started earlier, but where we have mohels coming into the hospital. And then later on, it just becomes the case that outside of Orthodoxy, mohels are only people who would sort of be at home in a hospital anyway, have worked as medical practitioners in some way,
right,
et cetera. And so I think we can really trace a historical through line.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think that this just occurred to me yesterday when I reread this paper, that the shift that I talked about earlier about women going to the hospitals because they thought it was safer medically in the 19th century just to even have a baby. I feel like there's kind of a parallel shift here too, because many women who weren't so religious but still wanted their baby to be circumcised, they thought that an obstetrician would be superior to a mohel, because an obstetrician was somebody who, as you say, was trained medically. And so there was two things going on. On the one hand, they were leaving the hospital before the 8th day. And so they had this opportunity to really make this decision much more clearly. And they also thought, oh yeah, I'd rather have it done by a doctor than a mohel, because a mohel never went to medical school and a doctor did. So the one thing in these letters in the archive that I found, what were rabbis trying to say, mohels are actually superior. This is all we do. We might not have gone to medical school, but we know how to do this one thing. The Orthodox world was still concerned that most Jewish women and Jewish families were not Orthodox. And so they were just concerned that this would just lead down a road of maybe somebody not Jewish doing it altogether, a doctor doing it, somebody not Jewish, somebody with no knowledge of the prayers. And that was something that they were concerned about, and probably rightly so, because I think that, I don't know what the statistics are now, but my guess is that it's not very high of people having mohels do it if they're not in the Orthodox world.
Yeah, we really don't have good statistics, but the concerns of a lot of those Orthodox authorities in the 50s and 60s and the sources you were studying came to pass, right?
Yeah.
There are many, many, many Jews who do have, hospital circumcisions, not any kind of Jewish context. Again, we don't really have good data, but, there are really these complicated realities now. And something I always find fascinating is that people have conflicting views. So some people think that obstetricians are safer, doctors are safer. Some people think that mohels are safer. And, there are all kinds of complicated reasons, or really no reasons at all, why people think this. These are some of the myths and complications of even talking about circumcision in America and in the Jewish community today.
Right. So at a certain point, though, There is, again, for the audience, at a certain point, there's a shift from women having longer stays in the hospital, which allowed in the time frame for a mohel to come in on the 8th day, to a point in history. And I assume this had something to do with efficiencies of the medical and the healthcare system. But there's a certain point at which hospitals are not keeping women for an extended period of time, and they're discharging them after a few days after birth, which then really puts pressure on this kind of dilemma that a Jewish parent would be feeling at that time about whether or not to have it done by a medical professional or a mohel, right?
That's exactly right. And so here's a quote that I found. This is from 1959, and a doctor, Joseph Miller, a Jewish doctor, complained in this magazine called The Synagogue Light that early hospital discharge on the 5th or 6th day, which was popular then, so that's 1959. So my mother said she left after 3 days. So maybe some hospitals were keeping people 5 or 6 days. This guy says, this made circumcision, quote, in the minds of many women, to say the least, a nuisance. They might be forced to return to the hospital or to host a bris at home with all the preparation that such an event entails. He says, the home will have to accommodate the attending people who come to the ceremony and the party afterwards. Then again, there's the work of cleaning up and getting the home back into order. So from his perspective, it's like, it's no wonder that women were just enticed to have the circumcision done earlier without a mohel, just have it done by a physician. He goes on to say, many of our women became easy prey of interns and private physicians. And he thinks that these people are misleading women just because it's a slight inconvenience to them. And the women who do this and who have it done earlier, he thinks, quote, do not realize that they deprive their sons of the right of the holy covenant between God and the children of Israel. So he's just trying to really emphasize that this isn't just a surgery that you can do any day. This is, a super important religious ritual. And the prayers and who does it all is just as important as, the circumcision itself. That's what they were trying to convince women of.
One of the things that you point out in your paper, which I think was a little depressing for me to read, but was so interesting, was that as the religious authorities were becoming more and more anxious that Jews might choose to have circumcisions not on the 8th day, but as a medical practice and not as a bris and a ritual, but just as like a procedure, the blame started focusing on the mothers and on women. Like the women were being blamed for making these decisions, which I think is fascinating. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I also found that depressing, but also just so right on target for the 1950s. There's just been a lot of historical research in other contexts about how women were blamed in the 1950s for everything from, autism to everything. Women were blamed. Refrigerator mothers, that whole idea that kind of came about in the 1950s. And it was, to me, was ironic because I remember reading that really the bris is the father's responsibility. Some people even want the father to actually perform it. So it was it was depressing to read like, oh, sure, now this is the mother's fault. I mean, the father, I'm sure, probably in many cases was also there weighing in on this decision. But yeah, but one thing that was heartening to me, there was, I did find some evidence from, I think it was called the Lakeview Home for Women and Girls or something. And it was like a home where women who were pregnant and not married went to, have their pregnancy and deliver the baby because it was considered such a shameful thing to be pregnant out of wedlock, that they were sent to these homes. And there was a controversy about who was going to perform the circumcisions. It was for the Jewish mothers that were there. And the head of that, Lakewood, said something like, these mothers have been through a lot and they're making a decision to give up their babies or to keep their babies, very intense decisions. They can certainly decide who's going to perform the circumcision and on what day it's going to happen and basically leave us alone. And I just wanted to, stand up and applaud her because, that's seemed right to me.
Yeah, I mean, it maybe sounds like we can position circumcision and women's perceived responsibility for circumcision in a broader process of sort of coming to view pregnancy as more of something quite significant and also something that is very much a vehicle of oppression for women in many cases, but also as something like really deserving of attention itself, and therefore a woman's domain in a certain kind of way, as opposed to maybe a father asserting ownership over the baby, over the family. I don't know if that's stating things well, but I wonder if we can sort of draw some connections even to how some of these debates about circumcision played out with campaigns for abortion rights and how to think about other kinds of reproductive issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't really thought about circumcision and women's attitudes towards it in the same framework as abortion rights. So I'll have to think more about that. But I like thinking about it that way. I mean, in general, I feel like, and I know you both have talked about this and in your previous podcasts that I've heard, but it's just so weird how we don't talk about circumcision. I mean, it's really a problem. I mean, whether it's women or men or, anybody, we just don't talk about it. And we kind of think that, I mean, for Jews, we just think like, oh, well, this is what Jews do. But then, Jews did a lot of things when it was commanded way back when. And there's a lot of things that most Jews actually don't do. So why glom on to this of all the things? I mean, keeping kosher is just one little example, but there's so many examples that many people have abandoned and yet stick to this without really thinking it through. I feel like that would be, I mean, this is why I like your podcast so much and the work that you both are doing, because I feel like you get people to talk about this ahead of time. Like, why? I know people who have gone through, pregnancies and like 2 weeks before the baby's born, they're thinking about circumcision. Like, you could have been thinking about it for 9 months. You could have been talking about it, thinking it through, discussing it. And, to tell you the truth, I mean, intersex issues, just to get back to my research, could also be talked about. Like, we don't even consider the fact that there is a percentage of babies that are born with intersex traits. And the fact that I would say until fairly recently, nobody even knows about this medical people do, but lay people do not know about this until it actually happens to them. And then, it's always been kind of considered a social emergency, even if it actually isn't a medical emergency. But when you can't tell if a baby is a boy or a girl, people are completely, flipped out about this. I'm not saying that there's not a reason to be concerned, but if you had given it 2 seconds, more than 2 seconds thought. If you had thought about it before the actual birth, it might not be such a shock. Like, this is something that happens and has happened since the beginning of time.
I do think this is the legacy of what you were talking about in your article. In other words, what happened when circumcision was medicalized in the United States, I think, this is just me saying this now, but I'd love to hear what you think about this or what Max thinks about this. But I think that what the medicalization of circumcision did for Jews was allow them to stop thinking about it, right? Like, I think that what it allowed them to do was to offload, because it is a very hectic time of life when you're giving birth and when you're having a baby. And I think for like psychological comfort, a lot of people try to offload the thinking about as much as possible onto professionals, onto the medical establishment, onto a doctor, onto an OBGYN. And so what the medicalization of circumcision did for American Jews was to literally allow them to stop thinking about it. I think that was the thing.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Ellie. And just to build on that and related to Lizzie, what you were saying before, I think a lot of rabbis really gave up the fight of trying to keep circumcision on the 8th day and, in the domain of mohels, right? A lot of the rhetoric that I think you really, really helpfully explore in this paper, although some of it, even in the 50s and 60s, was primarily Orthodox, even outside in the whole Jewish community, it really seems like this rhetoric declined and there was just very little effort to stem the tide of circumcisions happening in the hospital, not on the 8th day, et cetera. I think, the moral training programs in the Reform and conservative movements, which I mentioned earlier, which started around the 80s, were a bit of an effort against this, but not even that much in the way of education campaigns, I think, has come out of liberal movements to try to encourage people to, employ mohels and on the 8th day, et cetera. That mohels do, some kinds of reaching out. And I think a lot of clergy try to encourage folks to have a more traditional circumcision, but those efforts are quite limited.
Yeah, this is I wish I had talked to you guys before I had written the article, because
it's still fantastic.
I would have added these points. I mean, I think that this is right, that medicalization usually transforms, this is what I wrote in the paper, medicalization usually transforms normal conditions into medical problems. And in this case, the natural penis was deemed to require medical intervention, surgical alteration barely a week after birth. And that medicalization kind of normalized, Ellie, this was your point, kind of normalized a conventional religious practice that was seen by some as exotic by outsiders, exotic at best, and, maiming at worst. And in the process, helped to normalize, even elevate Jews, because they were seen as, they were superior in some way, because they were already doing this thing that was supposed to be healthful and good for you. And in one of the footnotes in that article, I have a quote by one of the Mitford sisters who said something about how her parents, they didn't keep kosher, but they didn't want to eat shellfish, and they were into circumcision, and they didn't want to eat pork because they saw this is what the Jews do, and look how healthy they are. So the medicalization kind of elevated in some way Jewish bodies, basically.
Which in a really sort of interesting way, you can think of a beleaguered people who have a history of oppression looking at this change and feeling good about it, feeling like, oh, for once people are thinking not that what we're doing is barbaric, not that what we're doing is weird and like from some ancient, non-modern past, but like, oh, we have an edge here. So that's like that's on the one side. I'm sure people had a sense of relief that they weren't going to be, persecuted over some of this anymore. But on the other hand, there was this ambivalence because they knew, and I think what you've uncovered is that they correctly sensed that what this was going to do was basically pose a kind of choice, and they weren't confident that the Jews were going to choose the religious version of it.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. And I did see some, articles in various, well, either in letters or in various journals of where you could see the consternation by these rabbis, like, oh, they're looking to us and we're doing the right thing. But we always want to remind people that, you have to do it in the proper Jewish way for it to really be, quote unquote kosher.
It's something that stood out to me when I first read your article and first understood that this is what you had discovered in your research, was that in a way, this sort of completely debunks one of the central anti-Semitic talking points about circumcision, right? Because there's an anti-Semitic idea that Jews, nefariously persuaded Americans to start circumcising their children so that they could be more comfortable with their practice in the society. And, there are different versions of this. And I think what you've uncovered here is proof that that is not the case, that this was not some kind of Jewish conspiracy, that far from it. While on a certain level, Jews were happy about it, on another level, they were very anxious about this change.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that that's exactly right. There was a deep ambivalence about this. And in fact, the original title for this paper that I was thinking of was going to be Good for the Jews? ? The Medicalization of Circumcision, blah, 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 whatever my subtitle was. Because, on the one hand, you would think that the medicalization might have been good for the Jews because people were looking at what they did for centuries in a good way, in a positive way and not demonizing it. On the other hand, as we've said, that people didn't feel they need the mohels and the prayers and the whole business. They just wanted to have the circumcision done. And not only that, you maybe could make the case that as things start to slip away from, the strictest way of doing things, that some people would then start to think, what do I need it at all for? And so, those rabbis weren't even considering that in the 50s. They didn't talk about what's going to happen when people stop circumcising altogether, but that did start to come later. And, I'm sure that some Orthodox and maybe other rabbis are concerned about that to this day.
Absolutely. And at Bruchim, we try to make them even more concerned.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when you start to, think about issues of consent and, the issues that we think about, the same ethical issues that we think about when we're talking about doing something surgically to a child's body in other arenas, this is going to come up with that too. And I think for many people who are very religious, they can separate, at least this is what I understand, because I haven't actually really talked to somebody who is, ultra Orthodox about this, but my sense is that they would say, yeah, for people who are secular, they might want to focus on the consent issues. For people who are religious, we're focusing on the relationship between God and the person, the covenant. It's like a completely different thing. It's a completely different arena. But what I would say is to that is that, okay, but a lot of people are not so religious. And so they are going to focus on the informed consent dilemmas. And so, I agree with you, as they should.
Yeah, so I want to return maybe to some of your work on intersex issues. Just curious in general if there are connections you see between some intersex issues and circumcision.
Well, one thing that I found was that I hadn't realized that there were some exceptions for Jews and circumcision, which is that if a baby is born with certain intersex traits, they might deem that it's okay to not be circumcised. And I hadn't known that before I, was working on this and started to look at the connections between the two things. And one of the reasons is, ironically, but one of the reasons is that if you need to do any surgical alteration to the baby's penis, which would happen at infancy, but not on the 8th day, if you were going to do any kind of surgery, they want as much skin to be there to do whatever surgery needs to be done. Well, I'm putting needs in air quotes for the readers, for the listeners, because that's a big question. Like, does any surgery need to be done altogether? And all intersex activists believe that in an actual medical emergency, then they're not completely against surgery. In an actual medical emergency, you need to make sure that the baby can void, whether it's whatever gender the baby ends up being. They have to be able to go to the bathroom. You have to make sure that, all of that is functioning. But surgical intersex management, surgical and hormonal, has really always been more than about a medical necessity. It's really been kind of a social necessity of what physicians have thought the definition of normal was for that child and what they kind of hoped. And a lot of it was based on the fear of homosexuality and the promotion of marriage. And throughout the 19th century, a lot of physicians talked about, well, how do we know that these people are going to marry somebody of the right sex if they're not even sure what sex they are? So there was a lot of homophobia involved throughout this whole process of what to do with babies who are born with intersex traits.
There's a lot to say about circumcision and masculinity as well, which is a topic I'm especially interested in. I mean, I think one other case to bring up or sort of way of thinking, you talk in your book about the way that there was concern among doctors, specifically that anyone who was going to be raised and socialized as a man would be able to pee standing up, and
Right.
sort of then, sort of interventions to try to ensure that, which reminds me a lot of the talking point around circumcision of, if people are in, a sort of locker room setting or something like that, is there going to be ostracism if someone's penis is different? And those sorts of concerns. I think people don't talk about those quite as much today for a lot of reasons, but that was, just such a common talking point related to circumcision, I think in the late 20th and even into the early 21st century.
Absolutely. And it's just supposition by the adults, it's just so much of it is not based in any kind of, actual evidence about how people feel about their bodies. And this is when I was working on my book, I was really thinking a lot about disability politics. And not that I wouldn't say that intersex is a disability, but I feel like we could learn a lot from what people who study disability politics have kind of taught us about, what we think we know about disabilities, and that a disability, and intersex too, needs to be thought of more as a difference and not as something wrong that needs to be fixed. And I think that with circumcision, as we saw, this kind of the medicalization is it's not our usual way of thinking of medicalization, where we think there's a problem, we need to surgically fix it. Here we have something that's like just the natural penis and we're fixing it. So it's a little bit opposite. But the same rules apply. It's exactly what we're saying. We have these suppositions that we think the child might be ostracized, or we think that they need to look exactly like their father, or we think, one thing or another. But have we actually really found out if that's true? And I think that the answer is no, we really have not. And even if it was true, does it have to be true? Like maybe we could socialize our children differently. And, now we see in the disability world, we see people who, and in the intersex world too, parents who are standing up to medicine with a capital M to say, thank you very much for, explaining to us what's going on here. We're opting not to do X, Y, or Z. And I think that's very, very hard to do in the medical world, because we think of physicians as, practically godlike. And if they're saying something, we want to do it. But we really don't have to do it. And I know many parents with kids with intersex who have said, you know what, we're going to raise our child to be comfortable with their body. And when they're old enough, they can make the decision themselves if they want to change their body in any way. And I know people with various disabilities who have done the same thing with their children.
Yeah, I feel like there are always these phrases or words that you hear when people are sort of grappling with these issues. So someone will say, it'll be confusing for the child, right? And you hear that of like, even people contemplating an interfaith marriage, oh, it'll be confusing for the child. Or with circumcision, it's like, oh, but he won't look like his father. And these are like phrases or sort of pretend arguments that are actually, I think, substituting for what are actual projections from the parents onto, like, it's a projection of the parent's anxiety onto the child as opposed to an actual thought out rational argument.
No, that's right. I mean, because also, does a 6-year-old look like their father? I mean, no, they're 6. The fathers are grown. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's not a good argument. It's not really an argument. It's just a thing to say. To get back to what we mentioned earlier, I think because we don't talk about this, we're okay by just throwing out these, I don't know what you call them, platitudes or something that really aren't good arguments for it, because we haven't been accustomed to making good arguments one way or another, because it's just something that we just don't even think about. And I think another thing that makes it harder to convince people that this is something that they should think about and maybe not do just because they think they're supposed to do it is that so many men who are circumcised are fine with it. And, I'm happy that they're fine with it. That's great. People should be fine with their bodies. But that lens that kind of gives people permission to just say, okay, well, I mean, all the men that I know are circumcised, they're fine with it. So why is this an issue? And, maybe if they knew some of the men who aren't fine with it, and there are plenty, if they, heard those voices, they, it might give them pause.
And also the medicalization of circumcision helps to hide the risk of complications.
Absolutely.
Complications that do exist, that do happen. They're relatively rare for a surgery,
Right.
but compared to not circumcising,
Right.
It's pretty substantial. And so, this just gets back to the point about how the medicalization of circumcision really means that there are a lot of issues that people don't have to engage with super directly.
Yes, I think that's right. The medicalization really kind of put a cloak over the whole thing. It's like, okay, now this is something that's a medical thing, and people don't usually go against a medical thing. The only thing that disrupts this from time to time is when there is some kind of, horrible outcome that reaches the news, like with mitzitza, and when babies die of, or they don't even have to die. It's bad enough that they get syphilis, but some have died, or some kind of sexually transmitted disease that they get from a mohel that performs mitzitza. And then that comes into the news. And then once again, that's a time where this comes out. And then you're just dealing with so many things like, having to explain to people that, this is just a very small subset of mohels that are doing this. And it really takes you away from some of the central issues.
Yeah, and just to clarify, by mitzitza, we're talking about the process of oral suction of blood from the wound from circumcision, which used to be far, far more common. And was an ancient Jewish practice, but is now mostly restricted to some Haredi, ultra-Orthodox communities, and where there are periodic outbreaks of herpes or other kinds of issues, for example, in New York. And that's something we didn't even get into much today, but I know Mitzitza Bepeh and sort of debates around that is also something that you engaged with in terms of mapping out some of the history of medicalization of circumcision.
Right, because one of the reasons why these rabbis were so happy that it was becoming popular and that non-Jews were, circumcising their babies was that in the late 19th century, there was a lot of publicity about a particular case where 4 babies died and they were trying to figure out why. And that was at a time when all the immigrants were pouring in and, the rabbis were rightly concerned. I mean, they were concerned because these babies had died. That's one bad thing. And everybody was concerned about that. And they didn't want to admit that it was from, and who knows, it probably was from my perspective, but, I don't really know. So they didn't want it to look bad for the Jews. And that's when they really started to, how are we going to certify the mohels to make sure that this doesn't happen again? But it also kind of led to them being happy when non-Jews were starting to circumcise their own children, because then they could kind of think that this incident had receded far enough into the background, into the past. They were worried that even Jews would see the whole thing as archaic and barbaric. But now that was receding, and here they were starting to certify the mohels and give them more education about circumcision in general, but Mitzitza Bepeh in particular, that things would get better. And then they did, so they did get better for the Jews in terms of non-Jews taking on this procedure themselves. But then this is where the ambivalence comes in, like we talked about. But then they saw that, Jews are also going to have their circumcisions done by physicians and not do it in a ritual way. And this is also bad. But, I found a great source when I was doing the essay. It was like a sterile circumcision kit that they were selling in Israel and also here. Basically, this man is saying, I'm so happy that there's this sterile circumcision kit. It's so modern. And all the things that I mentioned in my article that they wanted to convince Jews that this was the modern, using a mohel was the modern way, and it was medically sound, and it was great. This guy in the commercial for this was saying all these things. Oh, and he even said something like, this makes me feel so much better after all the fuss we had a few years ago. Well, all the fuss was some babies getting sick or maybe dying. That was the fuss, but he might have made it sound very lighthearted, like now we don't have to worry about all that fuss. Now we're going to have this modern, single-use, sterile circumcision packet.
Yeah, and I just want to mention, in closing, these are really fantastic points, but I want to mention that as we're recording this in late August 2024, Rabbi Jonathan Abraham is imprisoned in Ireland, allegedly for performing a circumcision on a non-Jew without the required medical license, right? So a lot of these questions of how the medicalization of circumcision and particularly the role of mohels interacts with non-Jews and larger societies are still very, very live and sometimes have big consequences. And this case in Ireland has really gotten a lot of folks to talk more explicitly about some of these issues of the medicalization of circumcision and, and relationships between Jewish circumcision and non-Jewish circumcision. So I hope we'll be able to have more of these conversations as time goes on, building on the really important points that we raised today.
Dr. Elizabeth Reis, thank you for being on the Bruchim podcast, and thank you for your contribution to our understanding of this subject.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I was delighted to be here. It's fun to talk about this.
Next time on the Bruchim podcast.
What exactly is wrong with Hatvat Dam Brit from your perspective? What kind of boundary is it violating? How would you describe why this is not the sort of way that we should be treating people?
The argument I'm raising with Hatvat Dam Brit is that it should be impermissible to do religious things to children's genitals. And that is whether you're doing something that alters their genitals for life or just that you're doing something that interacts with their genitals and breaks that boundary, which we normally hold as very sacred. And we tell the children later when they grow up that these are your private parts, and they can later understand that the event, those are my private parts, and someone got to do something or felt they had to do something to them which I am suggesting should not be permissible.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim podcast. If you like what you've heard here, please help us to sign up more Jewish communities and people to our Mark D. Reis Inclusion Directory. To apply, simply head on over to our website, bruchim.online, and under the What We Do tab, click on the Inclusion Directory, and then click on Sign Up Now.